Ned Block said, Blockhead passes the Turing test, but Blockhead is clearly not thinking. So this is a counterexample to Alan Turing's claim that anything that passes the Turing test is thinking. That sound right? You're all nodding. OK, who can explain why Blockhead is not thinking? Yeah.
So Blockhead is simply looking at a list and finding the next list. So if you had changed your response, instead of you had asked if he was enjoying math class, then he wouldn't have another list to look off of. Whereas if you're passing the Turing test, you can look at the response and craft a unique response to it.
So that's interesting. I may not have perhaps explained just how amazing Blockhead's list is. Because there was an entry on Blockhead's list that was, hi, enjoying philosophy, yes, favorite bit. There was also, what was the other question you asked?
I said enjoying math instead of enjoying philosophy.
There was also an entry that said, this was also a conversation string on Blockhead's list, right? He had that conversation string there too. And what was the entry beside this on Blockhead's list? Well, it was an entry that says, why are we suddenly talking about math? Right? So if I'd said to Blockhead at this point, enjoying math, he would have just looked up, he would have looked down his list and he'd have found a different conversation string, namely this one, and he'd have reported the quite plausible thing to say, it was right next to that entry on the list, namely, why are we suddenly talking about math? So it's not just that Blockhead accidentally passed the Turing test this time because I happened to ask him the right questions. Any questions we ever ask him, right? He's going to be able to give like totally plausible human-like responses because he's going to be able to look up that all possible conversation strings are there on his list. And next to them is always the appropriate human-like response to give at this point in the conversation. So his list is more powerful and more encompassing than we might have been giving him credit for. Yeah.
Blockhead is not having intelligent thoughts because anyone that we should consider to be intelligent should be at least able to like dynamically give outputs based on like the context of the input. So for example, if I was talking to Blockhead and I said, "Hi Blockhead, how are you?" He might say, "Great, doing fantastic, how are you?" But you know, say we were at Blockhead's mom's wake and I said, "Hi Blockhead, how are you?" He would say, "Hi, I'm great, fantastic, how are you?" That's like not an appropriate response.
Right, OK, so that seems absolutely right. Could we make Blockhead then into a thinker just by expanding his list a bit? So he has a list of all conversation strings in the context of a happy philosophy lecture. And then he has a list of all conversation strings in the context of a sad funeral of your mother. Right? And then he has another list of like conversation strings at the amusement park. And another list of conversation strings. And then the way he comes up with answers is he checks to see what the context is, right? Which is, you could be done very, purely mechanically, maybe just by, how does he see what the context is? Well, maybe he can register what the context is in some very mechanical way. And then he checks that particular list, right? In this case, the mother's funeral list. And next to the entry, "How are you, Blockhead? Stop," that conversation string. On the mother's funeral list, he says, well, holding up, but it is my mother's funeral. So yeah, so do you think then if we sort of gave Blockhead this whole bunch of lists, he would then be a thinker?
I would say no, because he couldn't possibly contain responses for every context, every conversation. He's limited for conversations up to 30 minutes. He's still limited.
He's limited, yes. That was on the assumption that his head is finite. And so the list can only be so big. right? And so already the number of conversation strings up to 30 minutes long is very, very, very large indeed. And so, yeah, as long as his head is finite, there's some point at which the conversation string is going to become too long, and he's not going to have a string that long on his list, and he's just going to go silent. So yeah, we could say what makes Blockhead a thinker is the fact that he can't talk forever. But you can't talk forever. None of us can talk forever. We're sadly limited by our biology. That rather restricts our ability to talk for a long time. And as long as, if he had all conversation strings, a Google sentences or less, he can go for a lot longer than you can. So it surely can't be that he just can't talk for long enough. That's what makes Blockhead not a thinker. Yeah?
We were talking about at the beginning that for something to be a thinker, it had to have intentional attitude. And kind of relating it back to the thermostat, Blockhead is outputting responses based on inputs, but he doesn't understand what he's saying. He's just reacting without comprehending.
Absolutely, but then the question is why? Yeah, we want to say that. Yeah, he's not understanding what he's saying. He's just speaking without understanding, without thinking about. So suppose the conversation is philosophy. He's not thinking about philosophy. He's having a conversation about philosophy, but he's not thinking about philosophy. So as the conversation concerns his mother's funeral, he's not thinking about his mother. He's not understanding what he's saying. We want to say that. The question is why? What is it about what's going on in Blockhead's head that makes it the case that when he's having a conversation like this, he's not thinking about philosophy, but when Callie is having a conversation like this, she is thinking about philosophy? That's the question.
I just have a question of clarification about what's in Blockhead's mind or head, whatever. Does he only have one output for each input string, or does he have multiple outputs that he can use?
We suppose he's computing a function, so that assigns to each input just one output. Yeah, so he doesn't make any choices at any stage. He just goes to the list that corresponds to where we are in the conversation so far and delivers the one entry that's beside it.
Then I would say that in human minds, I guess we consider multiple options before we give a single output so that the conversation at any point could change, whereas when talking to Blockhead, the person interacting with him will be considering various output strings where Blockhead will only ever give one because he only has one assigned to the conversation so far.
So yeah, there's some sense in which Blockhead's behavior is predetermined by the list. Even though he sounds like totally lively and like a free, engaged human being, in fact, there's only one output he's going to give. We can know that in principle in advance, given that the conversation has got to a certain point so far, right? So there's only one thing he's going to say at this stage in the conversation, and it can just be read off the list. Whereas there's a sense in which we make choices. Is that your idea? When we process, we kind of make choices, and it's not like that. Now, we're going to be talking about that idea, the idea that we're free in a way that Blockhead isn't, soon. There's some question about whether it's true. If it turned out that, in fact, our behavior was highly predictable in advance, and so I could know, looking at you and knowing enough about your brain, I can know exactly what you were going to say at any given point in an upcoming conversation, would that mean you weren't a thinker? What one might think, yeah, you were still a thinker. And so surely that can't be what's wrong with Blockhead. It's a tricky issue explaining what's wrong with Blockhead. The moderate conclusion that we can draw at this point is something kind of quiet, which is that what's going wrong with Blockhead is something to do with the fact that he's running the wrong kind of program. So he's computing the right kind of function. Thinking, yes, does involve being able to engage in conversations like that. But it also involves something more. And something more is running the right kind of program. So to make a computer, this is what Ned Block concluded from this example. To make a computer that can think, yes, you've got to run the kind of function, compute the kind of function that allows you to pass the Turing test, but you've also got to do it by running the right kind of program. Blockhead is running the wrong kind of program.